"Excuse me, young man," the flight attendant said coldly, though pretending to be polite. "First class is not for people like you." Jaden, the calm black boy, blinked lightly, looking down at his first-class ticket before meeting her disdainful gaze. "I have a valid ticket," he replied softly. "I belong here." But Claudia just gave a mocking smile. "Either you leave on your own, or let security handle it." Little did she know the black boy she had just tried to humiliate was actually the son of the airline's owner, someone who would make her pay for her racist behavior. The small suitcase rolled gently across the glossy floor of the international airport, weaving through the busy crowd among the neatly dressed suits and fashionable dresses of the hurried travelers. A slender black boy walked with calm confidence. That was Jaden Bennett, 17 years old, his bright black eyes hidden behind thin glasses. With a gentle smile and polite demeanor, it was easy to recognize his intelligence as he quietly observed the world around him. Today was a special day. Jaden had just completed his final semester at an esteemed high school with outstanding results and had received a full scholarship to a top university in the United States. It was not just a reward for years of hard study, but a testament to the perseverance of a black boy from a family with a poor but resilient past. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and glanced around the vast airport. Everything seemed to unfold in slow motion. Airport staff bustling around, directing passengers, announcements echoing from the loudspeakers, and colorful suitcases endlessly rolling on the baggage conveyor. Inside Jaden was a mix of excitement and nervousness, not just because this was his first-class flight, a special gift from his father to celebrate his academic achievement, but also because on the other side of this flight was a warm embrace from Victor Bennett, the father Jaden admired and loved the most. Victor Bennett, a name that commanded respect in the aviation industry, was not only the owner of the airline Jaden was about to board, but also a symbol of overcoming adversity, from a poor boy working as an airplane cleaner to a mogul who built a renowned aviation empire. Yet to Jaden, he was simply Dad, the man who patiently explained tough math problems, stayed up late with him during exam preparations, and always reminded him, "Your value doesn't lie in your skin color or your background, but in how you treat others." Jaden didn't like to flaunt that he was Victor Bennett's son. To him, his father was just his father, not the airline owner, and he was just an ordinary student wanting to be seen for his abilities, not for the name Bennett on official papers. In fact, except for a few close family members, no one at this airport knew that he was the only son of Victor. In Jaden's hand was the first-class ticket, a small piece of paper, but with great significance. It wasn't a symbol of wealth, but a milestone marking years of youthful struggle. "Enjoy it. You deserve it," his father had said when he handed over the ticket. But deep inside, Jaden remained humble, no show-off, no airs of superiority. For him, this flight was simply a journey home to where family was, to a warm dinner at the table, to laughter echoing through the kitchen, and to a father always ready to welcome him back. Jaden slowly made his way to the first-class lounge, his heart pounding in his chest. The plush leather chairs, the soft jazz music, and the rich aroma of coffee filled the quiet space. Jaden sat down, placing his hot chocolate on the table, and quickly texted his father, "I'm about to board the plane, Dad. Hope to see you soon." The reply came almost instantly. "Enjoy your trip, son. I'll be waiting for you at home." Jaden smiled faintly. Everything seemed perfect, at least until he met Claudia Harper, the one who would turn this memorable flight into an unforgettable experience. Jaden had just hung up the phone, his fingers still lightly scrolling on the screen, when his gaze accidentally swept over the service counter across the room, where two flight attendants in neat uniforms were engaged in casual conversation. One of them was Claudia Harper, the senior flight attendant with nearly 2 decades of experience on international commercial flights. Her dark blonde hair was neatly styled, and her sharp features and piercing eyes seemed to miss no detail of the passengers. The way she stood, adjusted her collar, or lightly smoothed the edge of her uniform all conveyed an air of distant pride, an aloofness not born from passion for the job, but from the arrogance of someone who believes herself above the rest. From the moment she saw Jaden walk in with his suitcase, Claudia had frowned. Her eyes paused on the neatly dressed but simple black teenager making his way toward the luxurious seating area designated for special passengers. He wore no fancy blazer, no expensive watch, and no shiny leather shoes like the other frequent flyers who usually visited this area. All Jaden carried was a worn-out backpack and a ticket in his hand. But what caught Claudia's attention wasn't that. It was the color of his skin that made her raise her head a beat longer. Her lips tightened into a familiar, deeply ingrained prejudice that colored her perception of people. Claudia leaned toward the colleague standing next to her, a younger flight attendant still busy organizing papers on the counter, then whispered in a dry, clipped tone just loud enough for it to be heard, but still carrying a clear sense of mockery. First class really is accessible to anyone these days. The younger attendant glanced at Jaden. Instinctively, her eyes briefly flustered, unsure whether to smile back at the remark or just ignore it. She lowered her head to continue her work, unwilling to respond. But that silence didn't stop Claudia from continuing to watch Jaden with a scrutinizing gaze from afar. It wasn't the first time Claudia had subtly revealed her discriminatory attitude toward passengers who didn't fit the unspoken standards she had set long ago. Passengers who dressed too casually, those who weren't white, or simply anyone who entered first class without radiating wealth and power. She quickly assigned them a cold and unwelcoming gaze, sometimes even showing blatant detachment in her service to her people, like Jaden, young, black, and simple in appearance, who were definitely out of place in Claudia's mind. He belonged in the cramped economy section, not in the expensive space reserved for busy businessmen or high-ranking officials. Jaden, though instinctively sensing the strange looks from the service counter, remained calm. He took a sip of hot chocolate, his eyes scanning unread messages on his phone, reassuring himself that perhaps he was overthinking. After all, this wasn't the first time he had faced such looks. Those seemingly harmless glances that nevertheless made one's heart tighten little by little. Jaden had long learned to ignore them, to move on as if they had never existed. But this time, he didn't know that those eyes would not only linger in scrutiny, but would lead to a series of discriminatory actions and humiliating moments on the very flight he had been eagerly anticipating. Claudia, from behind the service counter, cast another glance at Jaden before turning her attention to the upcoming flight's VIP guest list. She lightly ran her finger across the columns of names, her lips curling slightly as she silently confirmed her suspicion. There must be some mistake, because someone like that boy could never appear on a first-class guest list, not according to the narrow standards she had held for years. And from that moment, she silently set herself a task that no one had assigned to her, to find out who Jaden really was and push him back to the place she believed he deserved. A cool breeze from the air conditioner wafted through the quiet lounge, but Jaden remained unaware that the real storm was still ahead, starting with the cold stare that had just passed over his back and would soon transform into harsh words and cruel actions once he boarded the plane. Jaden had no idea that the scrutinizing gaze had followed him, like a cold shadow from the waiting room, all the way to the announcement calling first-class passengers to board the plane. He stood up, gently tucked his phone into his jacket pocket, and pulled his suitcase toward the line of people calmly moving toward the boarding gate, his heart racing with the excitement of being reunited with his father after months of separation. In Jaden's mind, this flight was the beginning of a new chapter, where every effort would be rewarded, a place where he could walk proudly among other successful people without shame or hesitation. However, just a few steps ahead, everything began to feel awkward at the boarding gate. Claudia Harper was already standing there, her face covered in flawless makeup, her lips gently pressed into the polite smile she reserved for each passenger like a line from a well-rehearsed script. She checked each person's ticket with proper courtesy, offering warm greetings and occasionally adding a few formal pleasantries. A middle-aged man in a light-colored suit who had just walked past received well wishes for a safe flight in a voice as sweet as honey. A blonde woman carrying a designer handbag was greeted with a slight bow and a flawless, friendly smile from Claudia. But when it came to Jaden's turn, the smile faded in an instant. Claudia glanced down at the ticket he handed over, and the moment she saw the words first class printed clearly on it, her eyebrows slightly arched, as if she had discovered something so absurd that it was almost impossible to accept, without a greeting or even a nod. She scanned him from his lightly curly black hair over his simple hoodie down to his sneakers, which had begun to fade, a look that seemed to confirm to herself one last time that this boy standing before her was entirely unfit for this ticket. Claudia took a slight breath, quickly regaining her composure. She didn't outright reject him or show open hostility, but the way she spoke, the exaggerated polite tone, made the subtle denial hidden behind each word unmistakable. "Are you sure you're at the right gate?" "Economy is over there," she said, gesturing toward the long line behind them as if that was where Jaden truly belonged. Jaden hesitated for a moment. He blinked, looked down at the ticket still in his hand, and then looked up, speaking as calmly and politely as possible. "Yes, I'm at the right gate. My ticket clearly states first class." He raised the ticket a little higher so Claudia could see the bold, unmistakable print. But instead of thoroughly checking and offering a professional apology if she had made a mistake, Claudia only curled her lips, her cold eyes scanning Jaden once more, this time with an unmistakable air of doubt. "There might be some mistake in the system. First class isn't for everyone," she drawled, her voice monotone, no longer looking at the ticket but staring directly at him. That statement, though wrapped in a soft tone, cut through the air like a thin, sharp blade. Jaden felt his ears burn, but he kept his face neutral, gripping the strap of his backpack to hold back the discomfort rising in his chest. Behind him, a few people in line began to whisper, their curious gazes mixed with raised eyebrows silently judging. Some eyed Jaden as if weighing whether he truly deserved to be in this position, while others turned to Claudia, waiting to see how this little drama would unfold. Jaden took a deep breath, looking straight at Claudia, his voice calm yet firm. "My ticket is perfectly valid. You can check again if you need to, but I'm certain I'm in the right place." In that moment, their eyes locked. One side was the cold stare of someone carrying years of arrogance and deep-rooted prejudice. The other was the composed gaze of a boy who knew his worth well enough not to bow to doubtful, malicious words. But Jaden had no idea that those words wouldn't deter Claudia. On the contrary, his unflinching confidence only seemed to fuel her desire to push the matter further, to see just how much this boy could endure before the challenges she had silently prepared would break him. And this was just the beginning of a series of discomforts that would last throughout the flight. A journey where Jaden, though accustomed to discriminatory stares, could never have imagined that he would face such blatant prejudice in the very first-class cabin of the airline his father had built. In the brief moment following Jaden's calm response, the atmosphere around the boarding gate seemed to thicken. The crowd behind him moved slowly, the sound of rolling suitcases scraping on the tile floor, the quiet whispers of a few nearby passengers starting to rise like ink stains spreading across a still surface. But at the center of all this attention, only two gazes were locked, one from Jaden, calm but resolute, the other from Claudia, cold and calculating, as if she were contemplating how far she should block his way without crossing the line of power she was so accustomed to wielding. Jaden gently raised his ticket higher, holding it firmly with both hands. His voice was soft but clear, as though he wanted all those standing nearby to hear, not as a plea, but to reaffirm his legal right. "I'm sure there's no mistake. This is a first-class ticket purchased in advance with all the details in order. If you want, I'm happy to wait while you verify it in the system." He still smiled gently, maintaining the politeness he always had. But in his bright, dark eyes was a steadfast look that made it clear to anyone that this was not a boy easily pushed into submission by a few mocking words or an unfriendly attitude. Yet it was precisely this calm demeanor that irritated Claudia even more. She had not expected this. In Claudia's mind, people like Jaden, young, black, dressed simply, when stopped at a first-class gate, would instinctively back down, muttering apologies and quietly turning away to head toward the economy-class cabin behind the place she believed they truly belonged. But Jaden didn't do that, and that was what pricked Claudia's stubborn pride. She pursed her lips slightly, a small gesture, but enough to make her meticulously painted lips curl into a distinctly mocking shape. She tilted her head, her gaze flicking back to the ticket as though searching for some invisible flaw to latch onto. After a few seconds of silence, not finding any crack to exploit, she decided to switch to a different tactic, dragging out the situation with subtle denials, just enough to let Jaden know he was unwelcome, but not so direct that it could be deemed unprofessional. How strange, Claudia slowly spoke, her voice dragging out each word as if to add more suspicion to the already tense atmosphere. In these times, the system often makes mistakes. This first-class cabin, usually isn't for people like you. She purposely paused at the final phrase, leaving it suspended in the air like a dull blade, still sharp enough to cut into the listener's heart with its vague insinuation, as if Jaden's presence here at this moment was so absurd it needed to be questioned. Jaden felt his heartbeat slow, not out of fear or confusion, but because he was forcing himself to suppress a rising tide of emotion. The familiar feeling that people like him often faced, suspicion, judgment, and disdain, simply because of his skin color or his appearance not fitting the mainstream standards. But Jaden also clearly remembered every word his father had taught him, that in moments like these, what mattered most wasn't winning an argument, but preserving his dignity, so no one could ever touch the self-respect that no one had the right to take away. Therefore, he stood his ground, his face remaining calm, his eyes never leaving Claudia. His voice still gentle, but each word came out clear and decisive, as if emphasizing the final pieces of an undeniable truth. I believe the system works very accurately, and I also believe that my presence here with this ticket is entirely valid. If anything is unclear, feel free to double-check. I'll wait. In that moment, the air became strangely still. People around began to look at Jaden differently. A few older passengers whispered to each other. Some frowned, others held back a sigh. No one spoke up, but the discomfort slowly spread like a thin mist weaving through every gesture, every look, and the slowing footsteps in the line of passengers trailing behind. Claudia, sensing the situation was becoming somewhat awkward, but with her nature unwilling to let anyone get the better of her, especially not a boy correcting her in front of so many people, straightened her back a bit more, her gaze growing colder, her voice even, yet tinged with visible impatience. Then you can just stand here and wait. I'll check again, but don't expect the outcome to be what you think. With that, Claudia turned toward the screen and checked the list, leaving Jaden standing there alone with his ticket in hand and the eyes of dozens of people behind him focused on him, as if they were waiting to see how this strange story would unfold, whether the black boy truly belonged in first class, or whether he would eventually be sent back to economy class, just as the prejudiced glances had expected from the start. Only Jaden wasn't waiting for that answer with anxiety. He knew he belonged here, and he was ready to wait no matter how long it took. Even with hundreds of skeptical eyes on him, Jaden stood there, holding the ticket firmly as if clinging to an undeniable truth that no one could deny. His gaze remained steadfast as he watched Claudia's back moving swiftly toward the check-in screen, her figure radiating urgency, yet unable to hide the frustration simmering with every step she took. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, much less taken anyone's spot. Yet each passing second thickened the atmosphere around him, as glances from all directions began to focus on him. The people behind him who had initially stood in a quiet and polite line now started to whisper, their furtive glances growing bolder as if Jaden's patience itself was the reason the line was standing still longer than usual. Some shrugged, their gazes quickly darting over to Jaden, before quickly looking away, as if afraid that lingering too long might pull them into a situation that had nothing to do with them. Others sighed loudly, making a point to emphasize their discomfort over the delayed flight, all because of a boy still arguing over a seat. Even worse, there were quiet headshakes and subtle mocking smiles from somewhere behind, as if this was nothing more than a temporary amusement in a space usually accustomed to absolute quiet and decorum. Jaden could feel every eye on him from all sides, each stare like an invisible needle pricking his skin, reaching deep into his chest, making his breath just a bit heavier. But he stood tall, keeping a calmness so unshakable it seemed almost unreal because he understood that if he showed any sign of hesitation, if he bowed his head or stepped back, it would confirm all the doubts those looks had already placed on his presence here in the first place. Meanwhile, Claudia had returned holding a tablet showing a passenger list. Her expression was still tinged with a vague sense of satisfaction, as if she had found the perfect reason to validate the mistake she had convinced herself of from the start. She approached Jaden, standing tall as if reclaiming all the authority she thought she had, lowering her head just enough to ensure her voice stayed between the two of them but deliberately loud enough for nearby passengers to catch every word. Clearly, I'll say this one last time. Young man, she stretched the words young man with a tone thick with sarcasm, then leaned in slightly as if whispering a secret but ensuring others could eavesdrop. This place is really not for people like you. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to call security. The words, though softly spoken, felt as heavy as a stone pressing down on an atmosphere already taut as a stretched wire. Jaden heard every word echoing in his mind, each one like a stone dropping into a tranquil pond he had been trying to keep calm, causing ripples to form. But even in that moment, he showed no reaction, his gaze unwavering, deeper and sharper than usual, as if to send a message to Claudia that she could use her power to make things difficult, but she would never have the strength to take away his self-respect. Jaden lowered his ticket to chest level, gently turning it so the passenger information faced Claudia. His voice was quiet but firm, cutting through her spiteful words like a sharp blade. I don't think this is how a head stewardess should speak to a first-class passenger, but I'm willing to wait here. And if necessary, I'll let security verify for me. Either way, I'm not leaving when I've done nothing wrong. A silence descended over the area, stretching a few seconds longer as if everyone needed the time to absorb the words Jaden had just spoken. No one expected the boy to remain so composed under the scrutinizing eyes, the pressure from the head of the cabin crew, the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to swallow anyone who wasn't strong enough. Yet Jaden stood there like a small pillar amid a silent storm of prejudice. Claudia pressed her lips tightly together, her eyes briefly flicking toward the crowd behind her, clearly noticing that the check was drawing more attention than she had intended. But she also realized that if she let Jaden walk past here, everything she had tried to do, the doubt, the sarcasm, and the overwhelming power she had been wielding, would turn into a joke in front of the other passengers. So she gave a small nod, coldly uttering one last sentence before signaling for her colleague to contact security. Well then, wait a little longer. Let's see who truly doesn't belong here. A faint smile crept across Claudia's lips as if she had just made a decisive move in a game of chess, unaware that from this moment on, the game was slipping out of her control. Jaden remained standing still, his hands lightly gripping the straps of his backpack, his gaze directed at Claudia like a silent challenge to the growing absurdity unfolding before him. But just moments after Claudia's final words rang out like a knife sealing the first round of confrontation, two security guards in airport uniforms appeared from the far end of the hallway leading to the plane's door. The sound of their shoes lightly tapping on the floor echoed steadily and coldly, like the rhythm of an invisible verdict already determined, causing the nearby passengers to tilt their heads and glance toward them with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Claudia turned around and walked toward them with an air of authority, as if she had finally acquired the weapon to completely end the stubbornness Jaden was showing. She exchanged a few quick words, quiet enough so no one could hear, but deliberately kept a stern expression and formal demeanor that made outsiders believe the situation was far more serious than it actually was. Jaden remained still, his calm eyes following every movement of Claudia and the security personnel, fully aware of what was about to happen, though he held on to a faint hope that everything would be resolved peacefully once the truth was confirmed when one of the officers approached, slightly bowing his head before speaking in a polite but firm tone. That hope was immediately shattered without mercy. Please follow us. We'll guide you to the assigned seat. Jaden tightened the straps of his backpack, biting his lip for a brief moment of hesitation as if he wanted to give one final explanation. But he soon realized that any words at this point were just pebbles thrown at a glass wall already fogged with prejudice. He didn't shout, argue, or continue to debate because in the eyes of everyone watching from down the hallway, not everyone truly wanted to hear the truth and not everyone would stand with him in a situation like this. Some people looked at him with pity, as if wanting to offer comfort but hesitant to speak up, afraid of getting involved in such a sensitive matter in a public space. Others frowned and shook their heads in annoyance, as if Jaden was the cause of the delay, disturbing the peaceful order of the first-class cabin. But there were also many indifferent, cold stares, people turning away as if it were someone else's business, just a trivial matter not worth caring about in the long journey ahead. Jaden took a deep breath, maintaining his composed demeanor, and then nodded gently. He followed the two security guards, his back straight, but each step heavier than ever. They escorted him through the row of seats under the scrutinizing gazes of the passengers on both sides, who seemed to be waiting to see if the little black boy would hang his head in shame or walk with his head held high in silent humiliation. The feeling of being dragged away from a place that was rightfully his was indescribable shame. It wasn't because Jaden felt inferior, nor was it because he was embarrassed to be moved to the economy section in front of dozens of watching eyes, but because of the blatant injustice unfolding without anyone having the courage to step forward and speak up. No one said a word to stop the chain of biased actions. It was as if, in their eyes, this was simply an unfortunate mistake, or worse, something that was to be expected. When the door between the first class and economy cabins closed behind him, Jaden slumped into the narrow window seat, his eyes fixed on the tiny window where the sun's fingers lightly tapped against the fragile glass. His lips were pressed tightly together, forcing himself not to let out any sound because he knew that if he allowed a tear or a sigh to escape, the strength he had built up since the beginning of the journey would collapse in an instant. Only when he was sure he had fully composed himself did Jaden take out his phone, his fingers gently swiping across the screen, typing each word steadily and calmly, just as he had faced everything up to this point. "Dad, they moved me to economy. Flight attendant said my ticket was a mistake, but I'm sure it's not. I don't want to make a scene, but this is really unfair." After sending the message, Jaden leaned back into his seat and closed his eyes for a few seconds, trying to regain the balance that had been disrupted by Claudia and the invisible system of prejudice. He didn't know what would happen next, nor was he sure if there was anything else he could do other than wait. But deep down, he knew that his father, Victor Bennett, had never let injustice go unchallenged. And if he had sent out a cry for help, Jaden believed that justice would not stand on the sidelines. Meanwhile, Claudia, on the other side of the dividing door, was still smiling lightly, her gaze absent-mindedly sweeping across the first-class cabin as if she had just finished dealing with a small inconvenience, completely unaware that what she had just done would spark a much larger storm than any flight she had ever served. Inside the cramped economy cabin, where the soft light from the small windows barely illuminated the faces of passengers who were either focused on their phones or sneaking in a nap, Jaden let out a quiet sigh as the message he had sent was acknowledged by his father with a scene notification just seconds later. No further response followed, no long-winded questions, no meaningless expressions of worry. But Jaden knew all too well that when his father went silent, that was when he was beginning to act. And indeed, just minutes later, while Jaden tried to focus on the blue sky outside the window to calm himself, not far away above the cockpit, the emergency internal phone suddenly rang. The brief, sharp, and decisive bell was enough to make the captain, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes who had piloted hundreds of intercontinental flights, furrow his brow as he glanced at the caller ID. The number displayed didn't need a name. A quick look told him it was a priority line from the very top levels of the airline's management. What stood out even more was the name associated with the phone number, Victor Bennett. Less than 10 seconds after picking up, the captain's expression changed entirely. The voice on the other end, though gentle and warm, was as firm as a sharp knife slicing across glass, clear, precise, and to the point. Victor Bennett was not the type of person to lose his temper or lose control, but when he spoke, everyone understood that his requests were not suggestions, they were orders. "I just received information from my son," Victor said, each word pouring into the stillness of the cockpit. "His name is Jaden Bennett. He has been moved from his first-class seat, despite his ticket being entirely valid. I don't care what reasons have been given to justify it, but I want you to verify this immediately and ensure that my son is treated with the rights he deserves." Also, he paused as though emphasizing the point. "Pay attention to the way the head flight attendant is handling this flight. I want to know every detail." The captain immediately jotted a note down, nodding despite knowing that Victor couldn't see the gesture, and responded with absolute professionalism laced with the usual caution when receiving directives from someone so high up the chain. "Yes, Mr. Bennett. I will handle this personally." Immediately when the call ended, the captain placed the phone back on the desk, his gaze turning toward the flight path screen ahead, though his mind silently drifted toward the passenger cabin behind the thick windproof door. He knew very well that from the moment he received that call, this was no longer an ordinary flight. And more importantly, the person responsible for the mess that had just been reported, the one at the top of the list who would be held accountable, was none other than Claudia Harper. A few minutes later, a summons was sent down to the service cabin. Claudia was standing in the small kitchen area behind the first-class cabin, adjusting her hair in the small mirror attached to the mini-fridge, a faint smile playing on her lips as if she were still basking in the afterglow of her victory. She had successfully removed a disruptive element, ensuring that the special cabin remained quiet and up to standard, just as she always believed it should be. To Claudia, everything was in order, and now all that was left was to serve the remainder of the long flight, silently basking in the approval of the passengers who shared her views. However, when a young flight attendant approached, slightly bowing as he quietly called out, "Miss Claudia, the captain requests your presence in the cockpit. There's something urgent to discuss." The smile on Claudia's face faltered for a moment, a rare occurrence since the captain rarely called for a flight attendant in the middle of a flight unless it was something truly important. In that instant, a vague intuition of something shifting beyond her control flitted through her mind. Still, with her usual knack for controlling the situation, she quickly regained her confident demeanor, adjusted her uniform, and walked briskly toward the pit, her outward calm so perfect that no one could have guessed the fleeting unease that had just crossed her eyes. Yet with every step, her pace slowed as she passed through the passenger cabin, where a few pairs of eyes watched her, some accidentally, others intentionally, as if they sensed that the story wasn't over. An undercurrent was beginning to rise from a place Claudia never expected. And when the cockpit door closed behind her, a whole new chapter of this flight had officially begun, and this time she was no longer the one in control. In is not a function. Victor took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling around him. He stepped forward, addressing the passengers with a calm yet authoritative tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to clarify something in front of everyone on this flight." His gaze swept across the cabin, making sure every eye was on him. "The issue here is not because that boy is my son. The issue is that every passenger, regardless of age, skin color, or background, deserves to be treated with the same respect on this flight. And today, you failed to do that." His words hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of the situation. No longer were there whispers or averted glances. All eyes were fixed on Claudia, who stood with her head bowed and hands clenched tightly together, a picture of shame and regret. Victor's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension that had built up in the cabin, and his disappointment resonated deeply with the passengers. "We will handle this thoroughly," he continued, his voice measured but firm. "It is our responsibility to uphold fairness and honor for this airline." The implication of his words was clear, and the passengers felt a collective sense of justice beginning to unfold. Behind Jaden, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. He watched as his father stood tall, unwavering in his stance against injustice. Jaden felt a swell of pride. He knew that today was not just about him, but about everyone who had ever faced discrimination. As Victor finished speaking, The cabin fell silent for a moment, absorbing the significance of his proclamation. Then, as if breaking a spell, a round of applause erupted from the back of the plane. It started as a quiet clap, but quickly grew into a wave of sound, echoing through the cabin. The applause was not only for Victor's decisive action, but also for the affirmation of what was right, an acknowledgement of the dignity that every passenger deserved. Jaden remained seated, his expression calm and composed. He didn't join in the applause, not out of disdain, but because he understood the deeper meaning of the moment. This was not a victory to celebrate. It was a restoration of fairness that should have never been in question. He felt the warmth of support from those around him, a silent solidarity that made the burden of the earlier humiliation feel a little lighter. Claudia, meanwhile, stood frozen in her place, her face pale as the applause washed over her like a tide. Each clap felt like a reminder of her failure, a stark contrast to the authority she had once wielded so confidently. She realized that the very power she had sought to exert over Jaden had now turned against her, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in front of the passengers she had once looked down upon. Victor turned his attention back to Claudia, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. Effective immediately, Miss Claudia Harper, the head flight attendant, is suspended from her duties pending an internal investigation into serious discriminatory behavior that goes against the core values our airline has always upheld. His voice was steady, each word deliberately chosen to convey the seriousness of the situation. The passengers collectively held their breath, sensing the finality of Victor's words. They understood that this was not just about one woman's actions. It was a statement that would resonate throughout the airline and beyond. It was a commitment to change to ensure that every passenger would be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their background. As Claudia stood there, the applause continued to swell, and the reality of her actions sank in. She had taken a moment of arrogance and turned it into a public spectacle of her own downfall. Victor's final words echoed in the cabin, a promise of accountability that would shape the future of the airline. Jaden felt a surge of hope as he watched the scene unfold. He knew this moment would spark conversations far beyond the confines of the aircraft, igniting a movement toward greater understanding and respect. This flight, once marred by prejudice, was now a testament to the power of standing up for what is right. With the applause still ringing in the air, the plane began its descent, a journey that had shifted from one of personal struggle to a collective awakening. Jaden glanced at his father, and in that shared silence, they understood that today marked not the end of a battle, but the beginning of a much-needed change. N is not a function,